This video is brought to you by Raycon.
And then gone, and the weird cat creature lived happily ever after. The end. Wow. It's crazy how much can change in a single week, huh?
I mean, I normally cover about 30 chapters of the story for these videos and then give you my take on it. The only problem is that with these latest 30 chapters, I was bored out of my mind by them. Now that's not to say it was super bad or anything, just that I wasn't exactly impressed or even had that much fun reading it. The material is very much setting up the chess pieces for the next 30 chapters after, and so guess what I did? Yeah, you guessed it. This week I'm reviewing 60 chapters of Hunter x Hunter's Chimera Ants Arc, because if I just did 30, all you would hear is about 15 minutes of complaining. And if living with my parents has taught me anything, it's that complaining gets you the wooden spoon. Now, there will be some complaining in this review, and by some I mean quite a lot. Lord knows I deserve it after constantly praising the story, but I will also be praising it highly in the second half and where I think it's necessary. So strap in and strap on, because we are about to go deep into this dense, thick series. I'm totally not Mark, I'm not okay, and this is my review of the Chimera Ants Arc Part 2. So, yeah, as I said, this week I'm covering 60 chapters instead of the usual 30, and let me tell you, stuff happens, but also stuff doesn't happen. A lot. Following Gon getting his Nen back after his fight with Knuckle, there's a lot of attention given to this one specific scene. And what a scene! Morel, one of the lead hunters spearheading the assault on the Chimera Ants alongside Netero, asks for Gon to prove himself by punching him, which ends up being a big mistake. Since the very beginning of this series, there's been a concerted effort to exhibit for us Gon's psychological state and how it determines the fate of himself, his enemies, and even at extreme points like this, his friends. Something that was mentioned maybe as far back as the Heaven's Arena arc was that Nen is closely linked to your emotional or psychological state. I remembered that small passing piece of exposition because I knew it would eventually translate to, if someone gets big mad, then they get big strong. And with a character like Gon, a small child searching for a father that we've all come to know as emotionally unavailable or sort of weird at the very least, there's been, at least for me, a touch of dramatic irony because, as a reader, I'm aware of something Gon isn't. I'm aware that there will come a time where he will be shocked or disillusioned by Jing, and as a result, this small piece of passing exposition concerning Nen will come into play. And shockingly, it did so much sooner than I thought it would. Faced with the possible death of Kite, someone he deeply cares for, faced with what has already been done to him, and wanting to get revenge on those that did it to him, Gon, when asked to prove his strength by punching an established and powerful hunter, proves in that moment that the emotional turmoil that resides beneath the surface of his cheerful disposition can fuel an attack more powerful than anything we thought he was capable of. Refraining from attacking at the last possible moment thanks to Killua, Gon could have in that moment killed Morel. Now, that's terrifying, and I think that while the main villain isn't all that compelling yet, I mean he does get a little bit more compelling later, I genuinely believe that at this moment in time he exists to act as a stressor for Gon. And somehow I feel, given the real meat of this material, the main portion of this conflict won't be found with the king, but perhaps instead the inner conflict between two individuals, Gon and Killua. And while we're on the topic of Killua, I think I should address something that I wanted to speak on last week. While Killua removed the antenna from his head, I personally wasn't 100% sure what would come from this, but now having read ahead, I can confirm for myself that it is exactly what he said it was, an antenna manipulating him. Alright, so time for my thoughts. From a fan standpoint, I really like that Killua is in control again, but from a critical one, I'm a little uncertain. On one hand, it was great to see him physically overcome a hold his family has over him. This, as you know, plays into the themes of oppression and familial obligation Killua has been fighting against in the story since he joined it way back during the Hunter exams. However, and this is a big however, the implant in his mind, while not breaking any rules of the world, I think in a way it felt a little anticlimactic, replacing what appeared to be a compelling and genuine case of psychological trauma with a tangible antenna, making for a quick solution to what was initially implied to be a much more complicated problem. And so, after discovering and confirming that it was all just an actual antenna controlling a part of his actions, it felt as though a tremendous amount of potential was lost for a compelling and intense story, which Hunter x Hunter seems to be exploring more readily with Gon. Throughout the beginning of this story, Killua was trying to become a hunter. Seemingly, this was his first venture and decision made for himself and no one else. However, despite his internal desire to do something for himself, it was his family's domineering presence that consistently prevented Killua from achieving such. The whole, no matter how hard he tried, he would still be the person his family trained him to be. That reality and that theme was intense in this story, and it was compelling because we thought it was something deeply ingrained in Killua from a metaphorical standpoint and not a literal one. This mind control device, in my opinion, sort of cheapens and fundamentally changes that entire dynamic. It wasn't that he might actually be like his family or that he can't shake his upbringing or genetics or whatever. Instead, it was a piece of metal in his head, and now that it's removed, he has full control over his destiny, it seems. Whether I take this as a metaphor or at face value, it is vastly less interesting to me than what I, and I assume everyone else, thought was going on. The reason why Killua is relatable in some instances is because he embodies that one kid that, while having massive potential to do one thing, is held back by the bad teachings of his family to do another. Something like that can't be overcome just like that, but by truly fighting tooth and nail against those bad teachings over many, many years. Now, thankfully, this moment Killua decides to flick that switch for himself does come about during an intensely emotional moment wanting to protect his friend, which is exactly what it needed to be, but again, the means with which this comes about seems deeply unsatisfying to me. But yeah, that's Killua, that's gone, and that's the stuff that happens in the first few chapters. So, what's next? Well, there's some cool introspective board game sequences with the king of the Chimera Ants and this little girl called Komugi. It's a really interesting way of coming to understand the character before he really starts to understand himself, asking himself questions like, who are you? Why are you here? What's your purpose? Throughout this section, the Chimera Ant King was giving me major Mewtwo Strikes Back vibes, and I can't be the only person who thought that either. At every crossroads he faces when left to his own devices, self-indulges in a much more negative path or mindset. However, when all the cards or tiles are down with this little girl he respects, he shows a very different side to himself. Outside of the beginning, this is the best stuff I thought that was covered in the story from a narrative perspective. There's a clear parallel being established here with Gon and this Chimera Ant King, and I really can't wait to see how this develops further. It was really interesting to me. But the rest was... That's right, now I gotta talk about my first major issue with this week's material. Chapters 220 to 263 are almost entirely waiting. Heck, even the chapter titles are in on the joke here, literally counting down from 10 to 1. Initially, I thought this was funny, but then I realized that this portion of the story actually achieves very, very little. Now, I'm sure most people wouldn't be bothered by this nearly as much as I was, but god damn, I was really bored. I'd even go as far as to say that the material after Gon's almost murder and before the palace attack might be the weakest in the series in terms of actual story progression and my overall interest. On paper, the concept seems fine. Build tension slowly to this massive genocide planned by the ants, all the while the side of good makes preparations to stop this all from happening. And normally this would be a good idea. You need a calm before the storm in stories like this. But this calm spans across 3 entire volumes of the story, and in those volumes the story felt like it had more padding than the 1990s version of the Dragon Ball Z anime. And this is a manga, and as a result, dragged the plot to a screeching halt, sometimes even cutting away to characters that have quite literally nothing to do with this story for like 5 or 6 chapters at a time. For the purposes of this video, I had to read 6 or so volumes of manga. And let me tell you, this volume, volume 22, delivered me an experience I don't think any manga I've ever read has given me. And not a good one. I found the material in this volume so insanely boring, I actually had to step away for an entire day just to work up to reading more of it. Now, before anyone goes off in the comment section saying that they loved it and that it's great for X, Y, and Z reason, that's totally fine. That's your experience. That's real. It's valuable and I can't take that away from you. But mine is real too. And my god, I hated this volume. nothing happens. To say that this volume absolutely and unequivocally annihilated the pacing of the story for me would be an understatement of a lifetime. At this moment in time, the Chimera Ants Arc's plot focuses on and draws our interest to characters like Netero, Kite, Gon, Killua, maybe smaller secondary characters trying to get us to know them, but predominantly those characters, as they deal with the aftermath and plan to exterminate the King Chimera. However, in this volume, a considerable amount of it, 60%, is spent with the Phantom Troupe and shows us what other parts of the world are like now that the Chimera Ants have infiltrated their regions. Now, you might be thinking, I wonder what role the Phantom Troupe will play in this arc. How will they affect the developing personalities and struggles of the main cast? Well, they don't! It was here I was forced to realize the Phantom Troupe's greatest weakness also, for me at least. They're sort of an ensemble. Characters like Uvo in York New City was given the most characterization during that portion, and he died. Additionally, the character of Paku received a similar amount of endearment to me as a reader for the exposure and stresses she was put under during that material too. Unfortunately, both of these characters met untimely ends during that material, leaving only one other character that received any meaningful exposure to us as an audience, and that was Nobunaga. And he wasn't present in this material for the Chimera Ant arc at all. Because of this, I found myself spending the bulk of an entire volume following characters I was lukewarm on, facing off against enemies that are very much secondary while also not furthering the story in any meaningful way. The scene exists to expose us to more of the troupe, and it succeeds in that effort, sure, but outside of maybe showing us what other places are like dealing with the ants, this portion of the material does little else at this moment in time, which made it difficult to sit through for me if I'm being perfectly honest. The pacing really was destroyed for me here. Now, if I want to be completely fair here, it's entirely possible that their presence may come into play later on in the story beyond what I've read today, and Lord knows I hope all that time I spent reading it was worth something, but even if they do, the means with which they are integrated is about as subtle as chronic dysentery. Anyway, to cut a long story short, Killua meets character development and Gon meets plot device. They all meet up and all seem to be in place for some story progression finally. Now, as we move on to the palace assault, Togashi decides to implement some significant changes. Changes that I think are best exemplified through this quote from the manga.
Something totally not Mark thought was quite strange was the sudden participation of a disembodied narrator. From Mark's experience with the manga, he didn't recognize this as a regular occurrence, and yet, by the time things started to really kick off in chapter 263, the narration has already been going on for roughly 4 chapters. Mark decided to do some investigating, and went to check out how this was handled in the anime, and found essentially the exact same thing happening. Without this precedent having been set earlier, seeing it suddenly come out of nowhere in the manga felt like a strange choice to Mark, and he would argue that perhaps even more so in the anime. Mark feels that this isn't the anime's fault at all. They are adapting the manga, is what you might hear him say if he actually had any dialogue during this part of the video. Mark feels as though people could argue that this helps to make these events feel even more special, and he understands that argument. But for him, this only served to sort of take him out of the story. It made him feel as though he, Mark, was reading about someone reading a story to him. Little bits of this here and there wouldn't bother him, but for multiple chapters back to back, Mark just thinks it's a very odd decision and at times acts as a bit of a crutch. Now, Mark is open to being corrected on this point if you feel he's wrong, but he believes this is an almost meme-level example of telling and not showing, an especially egregious offense in a medium that makes showing extremely simple. This reads as if it was a book devoid of pictures. The reason this makes Mark a little more annoyed than perhaps it should is that usually things like this, telling instead of showing, is the result of a lack of narrative preparation. Stories with no build-up typically suffer from this. An example of this that Mark would give, if not for the fact that his thoughts are inexplicably being narrated right now, is the last Airbender movie. Katara's narration in this film tells us that Sokka and Princess Yue became fast friends and fell in love. It does this bizarrely instead of showing us, as the series did through slow build-up. Narration here is being used as a crutch, now. This arc spent the best part of 40 chapters building up to an event, and now Mark has to sit through what he believes is clunky expository narration as this place is being infiltrated. There are things discussed during this time in detail, like Knuckles' ability to read a person's aura level, and from this, Mark thinks he knows why the arc is written this way. A few chapters prior, Togashi said he was sorry for the long wait and expressed concern that many people may have forgotten things at this point. And so, right now it's Mark's theory that Togashi is providing this narration not for people like Mark, who've recently read all of the story in one go, but instead has structured it this way to help keep people in the loop as they read the weekly releases in Shonen Jump after the long wait. In volume form, this isn't a good thing. Going up the stairs, literally every single meaningful aspect of every fight, and using a fucking elevator are all narrated to the reader. This is one of the single most efficient assassinations of an arc Mark thinks he has ever witnessed. Made all the more frustrating for Mark because he has endured over 30 chapters of effectively tenuous build-up, all for it to mean basically very little at all, as Mark sees it. These are characters Mark feels he's been forced to spend an ungodly amount of time with over the course of the arc, and for no real reward. Mark believes people could completely skip the first half of Act 2, in fact, without really losing anything of substance. It's explained to the reader in no uncertain terms, according to Mark. There's no subtext, as Mark sees it, nor anything to infer. It is quite literally telling the reader what is happening. Again, according to Mark. In his last video, Mark admired and praised the beginning of this arc for its use of subtext and dilemma, saying questions with no answers produce the best stories. Well, this, to use the layman's terms, yeets all of that out the window, as far as Mark is concerned, by telling the reader in no uncertain terms what everyone is thinking and feeling, and why they're thinking and feeling it. It sucks all of the drama out of the scene, for Mark, of course, and now he feels as though he's being told a story about this event rather than actually experiencing it with the characters he's developed a fondness for. Mark is immeasurably frustrated, and he is still not done.
When thinking about what Tom was talking about, when talking about what Mark had been talking about, when talking about Hunter x Hunter, in the end, I just couldn't understand what they were talking about.
At this point, you've probably heard of Ray J's Raycon brand, considering people like Snoop Dogg and Mike Tyson are obsessed with it. And that's not without reason. Nowadays, people are shifting more and more towards wireless earbuds as their daily drivers, but one of the biggest barriers to entry has always been price. And this is where Raycon comes in. Their wireless earbuds start at half the price of its competitors, but certainly not half the quality. Whichever of the many colors or patterns you choose from, you're getting a great sound product. And I am loving the V-shaped sound signature these things have. They really pack a punch in the low end while keeping the clarity in the highs and mids. It's a very premium sound, all in a compact, noise-isolating fit. Seriously, earbuds come out of my ears all the time normally, but I can dance around like a lunatic with these things in my ears, and they won't budge at all. They're absolutely perfect for my daily routines like walking the dog or going for a run, and most critically, they're convenient. The Bluetooth pairing is seamless and easy, meaning the moment I need them, they're ready to go. If these sound good to you and you want to support the channel, then click the link in the description or go to buyraycon.com/notmark to get 15% off your Raycon purchase. And with a 45-day free return policy, you can try them yourselves and see if you agree with me. I'll be enjoying these this summer, so I hope you do too.
I've had it! When will you learn that your actions have consequences?
Additionally, there are further changes made not just to the story, but to the visuals. One of the upshots to reading a manga for me was the visceral gore that accompanied the different exchanges that took place without compromise. Many different anime adaptations opt to censor the gore that would otherwise be present in the manga, and while this can be at times fine, sometimes it can really take away from the power of a scene. But now, for whatever reason, as I'm reading, the great artwork gets obstructed by this weird sort of out-of-place black shading texture box. It's a travesty. Now I can't see someone holding a bunch of thumbs or see someone's head get twisted off by Killua. I demand My fist of thumbs. Furthermore, throughout these 60 chapters, there were some great moments that I enjoyed too. Moments that made my life easier as I waded through this material that wasn't connecting with me at all. However, most of them unfortunately came with some sort of caveat. Anytime that Chitu clashes with Morel is a pretty fun affair, employing a great strategy on behalf of the protag while making full use of the Nen power system. His first altercation alongside Knuckle is great, but his real power is on full display in his second fight with Chitu, wherein we see his cunning and patience used to full effect. In this arc, battles are won not just on feeling and strength alone, but through patience and measured approaches. Something that Gon isn't exactly on board with right now, but I'll be sure to talk about that a little later. Outside of that, the character of Knuckle gets some tremendous treatment in this material. While I didn't really care at all about Shoot, Knuckle was a personality that was the clear highlight among all of the new characters for me. He's active, funny, and personable, endearing himself to me almost immediately in the earlier material covered last week, with further bursts of awesomeness this week after the assault on the palace. And this palace is where things start to really kick off. Chapter 263 to be precise. Something powerful is falling from the sky that's caught Pito's attention. And it's Netero. These subsequent chapters are total highlights, and I'm certain, given the extent of what I can only describe as insufferable build-up, I'm sure once the anime covered this material, people must have been extremely excited, given that Netero is acting like a total boss and we get a very punchy backstory. What I think is interesting concerning this material, though, is that from the moment he arrives to the moment I reach 60 chapters in, Netero wasn't shown attacking the king at all. In fact, we don't see him attack, period. For the entire time he's present, instead the focus is on the King Chimera, who's acting completely different to what they had anticipated. With Killua's grandfather dipping due to how different this situation was, with the king totally dedicated to the protection and healing of the blind girl, he instructs Pito, his strongest foot soldier, to heal her while he deals with Netero farther away to keep her safe. And while we don't see that fight, we do see something extremely interesting instead of that as the hero team rushes to the compound.
覚えているか?
And just like that, as if by magic, out of nowhere, this scene catches my wavering attention and gives it a much needed kickstart. And while I can say that my enjoyment of it wasn't at least a little bit affected by what came before, I most definitely did thoroughly love this. There are some truly beautiful moments that made exceptional use of the manga format. In chapter 275, the difference in the composure and mental stability between Gon and Killua is on full display for all to see. It's stark and it's brilliant, with Gon's crumbling face on the top of one page, and once I turn to the next, it's Killua's calm self there to reassure him. Choices like these really help to visually sell me on what's transpiring in this material. Watching as Gon barely clings to his sense of reason while Killua tries to bring him back from the brink, like he's done all so many times in the past, was possibly the most compelling instance in this story, and maybe not even just this arc. These drawings force you to feel as Gon does, conflicted, angry, devastated, and struggling. All of these swirl in his head as he desperately tries to find any excuse to unload all of this on Pito. But reality sinks in. Pito is reasonable and shows how serious they are in this encounter, forcing Gon to explode in frustration, though a frustration he's willing to make peace with. 1 hour. He will wait 1 hour and then Pito has to heal Kite. If there's any takeaway I have for this scene, it's that it helped to restore some hype in me for the conclusion of this arc and elevate my hype levels for another awesome scene. This is all great action, and after watching this dude brutalize both Shoot and Knuckle respectively, which by the way was way better than I anticipated it being, the combination of Shoot's sacrifices, Knuckles' tenacious, desperate strategies, all leading up to Killua's last-minute save, made for one hell of a beatdown that produced some of the most electrifying Killua moments. Overall, and with us heading into the final act, which I assume will be awesome, or at least I hope it is, I'm left feeling a little conflicted. On one hand, I can absolutely see and appreciate why so many people love this arc. There's plenty of pivotal character arcs either being stressed or paid off. It involves some of our favorite characters from the past, and it even succeeds in introducing us to plenty of new endearing faces, all the while putting on some great action. However, I can't seem to get past the various choices made made and pacing issues this arc suffers from, in my opinion. At no point during my read through of any of the other arcs in this collection did I feel as bored as the middle of this arc left me. Now, I'm always on board for a slow build up, but I thought this was a little excessive. While I'm sure the Phantom Troupe have a large fan base, I couldn't help but feel like their section was largely a waste of time. From a broader story standpoint, I was happy that they were struggling or agonizing over the perfect strat for entering this hostile situation with the Chimera King. Choices like that helped to build credibility for the third act or climax, but at the end of the day, I still felt as though that they spent entirely too much time setting it all up, considering every story's plan eventually goes wrong to create conflict. So in my mind, I was waiting for this story to get moving so that they could make a plan, because I knew that this plan would eventually fall through and they would have to improvise like they are doing right now. And I don't need to be a genius to figure that one out. I mean, plans are made in stories specifically to be broken so that tension can rise. And what personally really annoyed me is that I didn't even need to technically understand the plan, because when everything is narrated from what the characters do to what they think to what their individual plans are, it doesn't require anyone in the audience to understand their plan. The information during the narration is so precise and on the nose that it completely took me out of the experience and removed the best part of reading a manga for me: the subtext. And so now that I've been covering this story for a while, and with all of the arcs after settling in somewhat, for me, the strongest arc still might be the Hunter exams. It starts with a bang. Dotted throughout were interesting pieces of characterization, there were magnificent revelations throughout, and most importantly, there was a clear understanding as to where we were going, and there was subtext. If your audience thinks it knows where it's going, as a writer, that gives you a lot of power to plan seeds and switch things up. To this day, I still think that narratively, one of the strongest moves Hunter x Hunter ever pulled off was Gon versus Hanzo the ninja before quickly cutting to the end. That gave me the feels, bonded me to the character, maintained snappy pacing, and it surprised me massively. And the most frustrating thing about this arc, the Chimera Ant Arc, is that it's brilliant on paper, and yet its presentation totally sucked me out of it. The best scene for me within this material, hands down, that I cover today, has to be Gon's scene with Pito and Killua. And why? Because while the narration was still there in parts, most of it was dialogue, and thank God it was. Or that scene could have been compromised for me. I don't need Togashi to tell me how the character is feeling on the inside. That's the subtext, and this scene had so much subtext, you could read it all over Gon's face. And that's what I thought this arc needed to do more of. Stop relying on the narration. I should be able to derive any information I need from what they say to each other, from their expressions, or what they do. And at the end of the day, this was a terrific story, delivered in a way that I just couldn't resonate with, and may have left me a little disappointed. I'm delighted so many people across the world disagree with me and love this arc regardless, with even some cases, I'm sure, loving this because of the narration, with it amplifying the experience for them. I just didn't share that experience. I hope I can enjoy the final section of this arc. Lord knows things are heating up for sure. But until then, I've been Totally Not Mark. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you all next week.